Welcome to Blush and Blood. Blackwood Manor sat alone on top of a hill overlooking the small town of Ashford, Massachusetts. The mansion had been standing there for more than 100 years. Locals often described it as beautiful during the day. But at night, it was a completely different story. Especially on October 14th, the night of the wedding. The night that would become one of the most talked about mysteries in Ashford's history. And the night a bride vanished without leaving a single trace. Now, as I'm blending a little foundation and trying to make sense of this absolutely insane story, I need you to picture the scene. It was just after midnight. The wedding had ended less than an hour earlier. Guests were still laughing. Music was still playing inside the grand ballroom. Champagne glasses covered the tables. The florist's white roses decorated every corner of the mansion. Everything looked perfect. At least on the surface. The bride was 29-year-old Eleanor Blackwood. The only daughter of one of the wealthiest families in New England. Smart. Elegant. Kind. The kind of woman everyone seemed to love. She had spent nearly a year planning her dream wedding. Every detail mattered. Every flower. Every candle. Every ribbon. Every photograph. According to guests, Eleanor looked stunning that night. Her makeup artist had spent hours creating a timeless bridal look. Soft foundation. Classic eyeliner. Natural lipstick. Nothing too dramatic. Just enough to make her glow beneath the crystal chandeliers. And yet, by sunrise, Eleanor Blackwood would be gone. Completely gone. No body. No ransom note. No signs of struggle. Nothing. The last confirmed sighting happened at exactly 12:17 a.m. At least that's what investigators would later believe. A wedding photographer named Sarah Mills was reviewing pictures when she noticed something strange. One of her final photographs showed Eleanor standing alone near the east garden. The bride appeared calm. Almost thoughtful. Like she was waiting for someone. What nobody noticed at the time was the dark figure standing in the background. Partially hidden behind a row of trees. Watching her. At first everyone assumed it was another wedding guest. But later, that single photograph would terrify investigators. Because nobody could identify the figure. Not one person. Meanwhile, inside the manor, guests continued celebrating. Nobody realized the bride had quietly slipped outside. The air was cold. A thin layer of fog rolled across the gardens. The old stone pathways disappeared beneath shadows. And somewhere beyond those gardens sat Blackwood Forest. A place locals avoided after dark. Stories surrounded those woods. Disappearances. Strange lights. Unexplained sounds. Most people dismissed them as small-town legends. Until that night. According to one witness, Eleanor was seen walking toward the garden gate. Alone. No security. No bridesmaids. No husband. Just Eleanor. And then, nothing. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Guests assumed she was changing clothes. Taking photographs. Making private phone calls. No one seemed concerned. Until her new husband started looking for her. At first he laughed. Then he searched the ballroom. The library. The guest rooms. The terrace. The gardens. No Eleanor. By 1:45 a.m., panic started spreading. Family members joined the search. Employees searched every room. Security guards checked the grounds. Nothing. No bride. No explanation. The celebration instantly transformed into chaos. People whispered. Guests cried. Phones came out. Rumors exploded. And then something happened that made the situation even stranger. A member of the wedding staff discovered Eleanor's veil. It was lying near the garden gate. Perfectly folded. Not torn. Not damaged. just placed there. Almost deliberately. As though someone wanted it to be found. Investigators would later say this detail made absolutely no sense. People don't usually fold a veil before vanishing. Which raised a terrifying question. Had Eleanor left willingly? Or had someone staged the scene? Back inside the manor, Eleanor's father became increasingly desperate. He ordered security footage reviewed immediately. Everyone expected the cameras to reveal what happened. But when technicians examined the recordings, something impossible appeared. At 12:16 a.m., Eleanor was visible near the garden path. At 12:17 a.m., the screen suddenly flickered. Only for a few seconds. Then the footage returned. Eleanor was gone. No one entered. No one exited. No movement. Just gone. The missing seconds would become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. And believe me, as I'm putting on a little mascara here, this is where things start getting truly disturbing. Because the next morning, investigators discovered something hidden inside Eleanor's bridal suite. Something nobody knew existed. Something that suggested Eleanor had been keeping a secret. A very dangerous secret. One that may have cost her everything. And once police uncovered it, the case would take a dark turn nobody saw coming. Before investigators could understand what happened to Eleanor Blackwood, they first had to understand who she really was. And surprisingly, that turned out to be much harder than anyone expected. Because the woman the public knew, and the woman who existed behind closed doors, may have been two completely different people. To the outside world, Eleanor Blackwood seemed to have everything. Money. Beauty. Success. A powerful family name. And now, a brand new husband. She grew up inside Blackwood Manor. The massive estate that overlooked Ashford. The kind of place people only saw in movies. Tall gates. Perfect gardens. Private staff. Luxury cars. Generations of wealth. But according to people who knew her best, the mansion never felt like a home. It felt like a cage. As I'm sitting here blending a little concealer under my eyes, I want you to imagine growing up where every decision is made for you. Every friendship monitored. Every relationship judged. Every mistake remembered forever. That was Eleanor's reality. From childhood, she lived beneath enormous expectations. Her father expected perfection. Her family expected obedience. And the town expected her to continue the Blackwood legacy. Failure wasn't an option. Neither was independence. Former classmates described Eleanor as kind but distant. Friendly but guarded. Like someone constantly hiding part of herself. One former friend later told investigators something chilling. She said, Eleanor always looked happy, but her eyes never matched her smile. At the time, nobody thought much about that comment. Later, it would become difficult to forget. By age 29, Eleanor had built a successful career in luxury event planning. She organized high-profile charity galas, celebrity fundraisers, corporate events. She appeared confident, polished, professional. The kind of woman who could walk into a room and immediately command attention. Yet privately, things were becoming complicated. Very complicated. Especially after she became engaged to Daniel Harper. Daniel seemed perfect on paper. Successful attorney. Respected family. Clean reputation. Good-looking. Charming. The kind of man parents dream about for their daughters. The engagement made headlines in local newspapers. People called them Ashford's golden couple. The wedding was expected to be the social event of the year. But behind the scenes, some people noticed cracks. Small cracks. The kind that are easy to ignore. Until everything falls apart. One bridesmaid later revealed that Eleanor appeared unusually nervous during the final weeks before the wedding. Not stressed. Not overwhelmed. Afraid. She frequently canceled plans. Ignored phone calls. Became withdrawn. Several friends asked if something was wrong. Every time, she gave the same answer. I'm fine. But investigators quickly learned something. People who are truly fine rarely need to repeat it that often. Then came another strange discovery. Just 2 weeks before the wedding, Eleanor began keeping a private journal. Nothing unusual about that. Except for what she wrote inside. The journal wasn't found immediately. In fact, police didn't discover it until days later. Hidden inside a locked compartment beneath her vanity table. The same vanity where she spent hours applying makeup every morning. According to investigators, several pages had been torn out. Completely removed. Someone clearly didn't want those pages found. But the remaining entries painted a troubling picture. One passage read, "Sometimes I feel like I'm being watched." Another said, "I wish I could tell someone the truth." And then there was the final entry. Written only 3 days before the wedding. The words sent chills through investigators. It simply read, "If anything happens to me, the answer isn't where people will look first." That's it. No explanation. No names. No details. Just one cryptic warning. And somehow, things got even stranger. Because when police searched Eleanor's phone records, they found hundreds of calls. Most were normal. Friends. Family. Wedding vendors. But one number stood out. A number saved under no name. No photo. No contact information. Just a blank entry. Records showed Eleanor had spoken to this mystery person dozens of times. Often late at night. Sometimes for over an hour. The final call occurred less than 4 hours before she disappeared. Investigators immediately tried tracing the number. What they found shocked everyone. The number didn't belong to any registered account. No subscriber. No address. Nothing. Almost as if it never existed. But somebody had been speaking to Eleanor. Somebody she trusted enough to call repeatedly. And police had no idea who. Meanwhile, detectives started interviewing wedding guests. Most described Eleanor as happy. Excited. Ready to begin her new life. But not everyone agreed. One guest remembered seeing her alone before the ceremony. Standing near a window. Quietly crying. Another recalled seeing her reading something on her phone. Then immediately deleting it. A third witness claimed Eleanor seemed terrified whenever her father entered the room. At first these details seemed insignificant. Tiny pieces of a much larger puzzle. But together, they created a disturbing image. A woman carrying secrets. A woman living under pressure. A woman who may have known something terrible was about to happen. Then investigators discovered something hidden among her wedding belongings. A small envelope. Unmarked. Sealed. And tucked inside one of her makeup bags. The envelope contained a single photograph. No note. No explanation. Just a photograph. The image showed Eleanor standing beside a young woman nobody recognized. The picture appeared old. At least 10 years old. The mystery woman had dark hair. Blue eyes. And a striking resemblance to Eleanor. Almost like they were related. But when investigators asked family members who she was, nobody had an answer. Not her father. Not her relatives. Not even her closest friends. And that's when detectives started asking a dangerous question. Who was the woman in the photograph? And why had Eleanor hidden the picture among her most personal belongings? Because what investigators would eventually learn about that photograph would completely change the direction of the case. And lead them toward a secret that Blackwood Manor had been hiding for years. A secret powerful enough to destroy lives. A secret someone may have been willing to kill for. By the time investigators reached this point in the case, the Blackwood Manor investigation had already stopped feeling like a missing person case and started feeling like something much darker. Something carefully constructed. Something hidden for years. Because every answer they uncovered about Eleanor Blackwood only created more questions. And that photograph found in her makeup bag, it became the first real crack in the story everyone believed. As I'm lightly applying eyeliner here, just trying to stay focused because this part gets intense, I need you to picture that photo again. Two women, standing side by side, smiling. But something about the image felt wrong. Not staged wrong. Not edited wrong. But emotionally wrong. Like it was taken in a moment that should never have been captured. Investigators sent the image for enhancement. They zoomed in, cleaned the edges, studied the background. What they found was subtle but disturbing. The photo was taken outside a private facility. Not a home. Not a park. Not a school. But something that looked like a long-term care institution or private medical residence. The kind of place that doesn't appear in public directories easily. And Eleanor, she looked younger. Maybe 17 or 18. The unknown woman beside her looked slightly older. Protective. Familiar. Like someone who had a role in her life that no one else knew about. Detectives immediately began trying to identify the second woman. But here's where things got strange. No one in Eleanor's family claimed to recognize her. No childhood friends recognized her. Even staff who had worked at Blackwood Manor for decades said they had never seen her before. It was as if the woman didn't exist in Eleanor's known life at all. Which meant only one thing. She belonged to a part of Eleanor's life that had been hidden. Deliberately. And carefully. Meanwhile, investigators returned to Eleanor's journal. The torn pages suddenly felt more important than ever. Forensic analysts examined the paper fragments. What they found was unsettling. Ink impressions remained on the sheets beneath the torn pages. Using specialized lighting, they recovered partial sentences. Fragments like, "They said I was too young to remember. If my father finds out. She promised she would protect me." And then one partial line that made detectives pause completely. Blackwood never had just one daughter. That single sentence changed everything. Because up until that moment, everyone believed Eleanor was an only child. The sole heir to the Blackwood estate. But now, that assumption was in question. As investigators dug deeper into family records, they discovered something odd. There were gaps. Entire periods of Eleanor's early childhood that were poorly documented. School records that didn't fully align. Medical records that were partially redacted. Even photographs from certain years seemed missing. And whenever detectives asked Eleanor's father about it, his responses became defensive. Short. Controlled. Almost rehearsed. One investigator later described the interviews as, like speaking to someone carefully avoiding a landmine. Then came the breakthrough. A former household staff member, an elderly woman who had worked at Blackwood Manor for over 25 years, agreed to speak privately. She was nervous. Shaking. And repeatedly asked if her name would be protected. What she said next changed the entire direction of the investigation. She claimed that Blackwood Manor had once housed another child. A girl. Same age range as Eleanor. But she was never introduced publicly. Never photographed with the family. Never spoken about. According to the staff member, the girl lived inside a restricted section of the estate. A wing that most employees were never allowed to enter. When asked what happened to her, the woman paused for a long time. Then quietly said, "One day, she was just gone." And nobody was allowed to ask why. That sentence hit investigators hard. Because just gone wasn't an explanation. It was a cover-up. At this point, the case shifted from missing bride to possible long-buried family secret. And maybe something even worse. But the most chilling discovery was still ahead. Because when detectives re-examined Eleanor's final phone activity, they found something hidden beneath the surface logs. A series of encrypted messages. Deleted. Recovered through forensic software. Most of them were short. Urgent. Fragmented. But one stood out more than the rest. Sent just hours before the wedding. It read, "If I go through with this, I lose everything. If I don't, they'll never stop looking." No signature. No context. But investigators now had something they didn't have before. Fear. Real fear. And someone or something Eleanor believed was powerful enough to control her entire life. At this stage, detectives began asking a terrifying question. Was Eleanor Blackwood truly the bride who disappeared? Or was she someone trying to escape something far older than the wedding itself? And the answer to that question was hidden somewhere inside Blackwood Manor. Behind doors no one had opened in years. And secrets the family never wanted to come to light. By now, investigators weren't just trying to locate Eleanor Blackwood. They were trying to understand her final hours. Because somewhere between the wedding toast and her disappearance, something had changed. Something sharp. Something immediate. And maybe, something planned. As I'm slowly blending a bit of lipstick here, just trying to keep things calm, this is the part where everything starts tightening like a noose. Because the last confirmed people who saw Eleanor alive all told slightly different versions of the same night. And none of them fully matched. The most important witness was her new husband, Daniel Harper. At first, Daniel appeared cooperative. Composed. Even calm. Maybe too calm. He told investigators that after the ceremony ended, Eleanor was happy and overwhelmed. According to him, she stepped away briefly to get some air. He assumed she went to the garden. He said he didn't think much of it at the time. Because in his words, she just needed a moment. Brides do that all the time. But when detectives pressed him about the timeline, his answers started to shift. Subtly. But noticeably. First, he said he last saw her at around 12:10 a.m. Then 12:15 a.m. Then he wasn't entirely sure. And that inconsistency immediately raised suspicion. Because in cases like this, memory usually sharpens under pressure. Not blurs. But Daniel wasn't the only person who saw her. The wedding planner, Melissa Grant, gave a different account. She remembered seeing Eleanor near the staircase just before midnight. She said Eleanor looked distracted. Not joyful. Not celebratory. Distracted. Like she was listening to something no one else could hear. Melissa also mentioned something strange. Eleanor was holding her phone tightly. And every time it buzzed, she flinched. Not casually. Not normally. But like it startled her. Then there was the bartender. He reported seeing Eleanor at the edge of the reception area around 12:05 a.m. He described her appearance in detail. Soft makeup still intact. Foundation flawless. Lipstick slightly faded from the evening. And eyeliner smudged just a little at the corners. But what stood out to him wasn't her appearance. It was her expression. He said. She looked like she wanted to leave without being seen. That statement changed everything. Because it suggested intention. Not accident. Not wandering. But escape. And then came the final sighting. The one that carried the most weight. A security guard stationed near the east exit. He reported seeing Eleanor near the garden path at approximately 12:16 a.m. He said she was alone. Moving quickly. But not running. Like she knew exactly where she was going. He also noticed something unusual. Eleanor didn't look back once. Not even when she reached the edge of the garden lights. And then she disappeared into the fog. He assumed she exited the property through the service gate. Until later. When they realized no gate logs showed her leaving, no cameras captured her exiting, and no one saw her outside the perimeter, which meant one terrifying possibility. She never actually left the estate grounds. But what made this even more unsettling was what the security guard added after a long pause. He said there was one more person near the garden that night. Someone he hadn't mentioned initially because he wasn't sure it mattered. A figure standing near the hedge line. Tall. Still. Watching Eleanor. When asked to describe them, he hesitated. Then said. It felt like they were waiting for her to arrive. Investigators immediately demanded more detail. But the guard couldn't provide much else. Only that the figure wasn't moving. Wasn't reacting. Just observing. And when he looked away for a moment, both Eleanor and the figure were gone. At that point, detectives started comparing all witness statements side by side. And something disturbing emerged. Every sighting of Eleanor that night involved movement toward the garden. Never away from it. Almost as if every path she took led her there. Voluntarily or not. And the more investigators studied her phone data, the clearer it became that Eleanor had received a final message shortly before she disappeared. The content was deleted. But metadata confirmed it existed. Sent at 12:11 a.m. Read within seconds. No reply. Just silence. And immediately after reading it, Eleanor left the reception. As I'm gently fixing my mascara here, I need you to understand how important that timing is. Because that means something, or someone, pulled her attention away from everything else. Her wedding. Her guests. Her new life. And possibly led her directly into the night she vanished. And the question investigators couldn't escape was simple. Who sent that message? And why did Eleanor respond by walking alone into the darkest part of Blackwood Manor? Because whatever happened in those final minutes was not random. It was directed. And the person who directed it was likely still out there. Watching. Waiting. And far closer than anyone realized. By the time dawn broke over Blackwood Manor, the celebration was over. What remained was something far colder. A crime scene. Yellow tape wrapped around rose gardens that only hours earlier had been filled with music and laughter. And inside those gates, detectives began what would become one of the most complicated investigations Ashford had ever seen. As I'm dusting a little setting powder under my eyes here, I need you to picture the shift that happens at a scene like this. One moment it's a wedding. The next moment it's evidence. Every flower becomes potential context. Every footprint becomes a lead. Every smile from last night becomes something investigators now question. The first priority was securing the perimeter. No one in. No one out. Guests were interviewed on site before they were allowed to leave. Phones were collected for forensic review. Security footage was seized from every camera in the estate. But almost immediately, investigators ran into a problem. Blackwood Manor was old. Very old. And its surveillance system wasn't centralized. Different wings had different systems. Some cameras looped every few hours. Some had blind spots. And some weren't working at all. Which meant the most critical window of time, between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m., was fragmented, incomplete, and frustratingly inconsistent. Detective Laura Bennett was assigned lead investigator on the case. She had worked missing persons before. High-profile cases. Complicated cases. But even she later admitted something felt different about this one. She said it didn't feel like a disappearance. It felt like a removal. Deliberate. Controlled. Like someone had planned for every possible reaction. Her first order was to re-interview everyone who saw Eleanor that night. Starting with the wedding staff. Then guests. Then family. Patterns began to emerge quickly. Too quickly. because almost every witness described Eleanor the same way. Calm earlier in the evening, increasingly distant as time passed, and finally, alone. But when detectives compared timelines, nothing aligned perfectly. Some guests placed her inside the ballroom at 12:05 a.m. Others insisted she was already outside. One even claimed she saw Eleanor speaking quietly with someone near the east corridor. But when asked who, she couldn't say. Only that the conversation looked serious. Not emotional. Not casual. Serious. Meanwhile, forensic teams began processing the garden area where Eleanor was last seen. And that's when they found something subtle. Almost invisible at first. A single set of footprints. Partially disturbed by overnight movement. Heading from the garden path toward the tree line. But here's what made them unsettling. They weren't just one set. They overlapped. Suggesting two people had walked that same path in close succession. Or together. But at different speeds. One moving slightly faster. One slower. Almost like a lead. And a follow. Investigators cast the impressions immediately. But weather and soft ground made identification difficult. No clear shoe brand. No distinct tread pattern. Just direction. Intent. And tension. Then came the second discovery. Near the garden gate where Eleanor's veil was found. A small object was recovered from the soil. A broken hairpin. Elegant. Expensive. And consistent with what Eleanor wore that night. But it had something unusual attached. A tiny piece of fabric. Not from her wedding dress. Different material. Different texture. And darker in color. Forensic analysis would take time. But early indications suggested it did not belong to Eleanor. Which meant she may not have been alone in that final moment. Not even close. Meanwhile, Detective Bennett turned her attention to Eleanor's husband again. Daniel Harper. Because something about his timeline still didn't sit right. He was consistent in tone. But inconsistent in detail. And when investigators asked him to walk through the night minute by minute, he hesitated. More than once. At one point, he paused for nearly 10 seconds before answering a simple question. Where were you at 12:17 a.m.? His response. I was looking for her. But when pressed for specifics, he couldn't name the exact location. Not immediately. Not clearly. And that gap mattered. Because 12:17 a.m. was the exact moment Eleanor was last seen on camera. Or more accurately, the moment she disappeared from it. Detectives began reviewing Daniel's phone records next. And what they found added another layer of confusion. His phone had moved across multiple locations during the critical time window. Ballroom. Garden edge. East corridor. But the transitions were too fast. Almost as if he was moving between areas quickly. Searching. Or avoiding something. Or someone. And then came a detail that changed the emotional tone of the entire case. One of the bridesmaids came forward with something she had not mentioned earlier. She said Eleanor pulled her aside briefly during the reception. Just minutes before disappearing. And what she said was simple. But chilling. She told me she didn't feel safe tonight. When asked why she didn't report it immediately, the bridesmaid broke down. She said, I thought it was wedding stress. I didn't think it was real. That sentence haunted investigators. Because if Eleanor had expressed fear, then her disappearance wasn't spontaneous. It was anticipated. And possibly even prevented from being stopped. As the first night of investigation came to an end, Detective Bennett stood alone in the garden where everything began. The roses were still there. The light still hung above the pathways. But the energy had changed completely. She looked at the tree line where Eleanor vanished. And said something quietly to her team. She didn't just walk into the dark. She was led there. And at that moment, the investigation stopped being about where Eleanor went and started becoming about who made sure she went there. By the second day of the investigation, Blackwood Manor no longer felt like a wedding venue. It felt like a puzzle. One where every object might matter. And every detail might be hiding something bigger. As I'm slowly doing a bit of concealer here, trying to stay focused because this part gets very twist-heavy, detectives began shifting their attention from people to objects. Because when people lie, things usually don't. The first breakthrough came from Eleanor's bridal suite. A room that had been sealed off immediately after the disappearance. Forensic teams combed through it inch by inch. At first glance, everything looked normal. Too normal. The bed was neatly made. The makeup table was organized. Her wedding dress had already been removed for safe storage. Even her perfume bottles were aligned perfectly. But perfection in a crime scene is never a good sign, because it usually means someone cleaned up carefully. Too carefully. Then investigators noticed something strange on the vanity mirror. A faint smudge. Barely visible. Almost erased. Using forensic light, they enhanced the surface. And what appeared underneath made the entire room shift emotionally. A message. Written in what looked like lipstick. Faint. Rushed. And partially wiped away. Only a few words were readable. Don't trust. That was it. No name. No explanation. Just those 2 words. Detective Bennett immediately ordered the mirror collected for analysis. Because this wasn't accidental. Someone had written it. And someone else had tried to remove it. Then came another discovery. Inside Eleanor's makeup bag. Hidden beneath foundation bottles and brushes. A small recording device. Old. Portable. And intentionally concealed. When tech analysts powered it on, they found a single audio file. Corrupted in places. But still partially recoverable. The recording was short. Less than 2 minutes. But what could be heard clearly changed the entire direction of the case. A woman's voice. Shaky. Low. Eleanor. She was whispering. At one point she says, "If I don't make it out tonight, it wasn't an accident." Then a pause. Heavy breathing. Footsteps in the background. And another voice. A man's voice. Unidentified. Calm. Controlled. The audio cuts before anything more is understood. But investigators now had proof of something critical. Eleanor knew she was in danger before she disappeared. And she was recording it. Meanwhile, outside the mansion, search teams expanded into Blackwood Forest. The same forest Eleanor had been seen walking toward. It was dense. Unstable terrain. And known for poor visibility at night. Within hours, they found something else. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. Dark. Expensive material. Not from Eleanor's wedding dress. But consistent with the unknown fabric found earlier near the garden gate. Which meant one thing. The movement didn't stop at the garden. It continued into the forest. And possibly beyond. Back inside the manor, detectives turned their attention to the missing pages of Eleanor's journal again. This time, they used chemical analysis to recover faint impressions from a torn page fragment. And what they reconstructed was disturbing. It read, "He keeps saying it's for my protection, but I don't believe him. The house knows more than people think. I heard them arguing in the East Wing again." Then a final fragment. "There are rooms here I was never supposed to find." That last line shifted everything. Because it suggested Eleanor wasn't just afraid of a person. She was afraid of the place itself. Blackwood Manor. A house with sealed rooms. Hidden wings. And a history no one had fully examined. Detective Bennett immediately requested architectural blueprints of the estate. What she discovered surprised even the forensic team. There were inconsistencies, false walls, renovation records that didn't match structural layouts, and one entire section of the manor that had no official access records, no documented entry points, and no renovation explanation. Just a blank space in the building's history. A space that technically existed, but was never acknowledged. Meanwhile, interviews with staff became even more revealing. A former groundskeeper admitted something unusual. He said that certain parts of the estate were always off-limits. Not because of security, but because of family rules. He described one corridor in particular. A hallway that was always locked, always dark, and never used. When asked what was inside, he said, "No one ever told us. And no one ever asked twice." But what he added next was even more unsettling. He claimed that on the night of the wedding, he saw lights in that restricted area. Faint movement behind windows that were supposed to be sealed. As if someone had been inside. Or something had been opened. And that raised a terrifying possibility. Was Eleanor being pulled into something hidden inside the manor itself? Or was she trying to escape something already inside it? As I'm putting on a bit of lipstick here, this is where the case starts feeling like it's no longer about outside danger, but inside architecture. Inside history. Inside the walls themselves. Because every clue so far was pointing back to one place. Blackwood Manor. And whatever was hidden inside it was still waiting to be uncovered. By the third day, Blackwood Manor was no longer just a crime scene. It was becoming something else entirely. A place where silence felt intentional. Like the house itself was holding its breath. As I'm lightly blending some contour here, this is the part where the investigation stops being about missing bride and starts becoming something far more disturbing. Because that hidden section of the manor, the one with no official records, Detective Bennett finally got access to it. And what they found there changed everything. The entrance wasn't obvious. In fact, it wasn't supposed to be visible at all. A section of the east wing had a false wall panel behind what looked like an antique bookshelf. No handles. No markings. Just pressure points that only someone familiar with the structure would know how to open. Which immediately raised one question. Who designed this house to have secrets like this? Inside, the air was different. Colder. Drier. Like the space hadn't been used in a long time. The hallway was narrow. The lighting barely functional. And the walls were lined with old portraits. Not of guests. Not of family gatherings. But individuals investigators couldn't identify. Each one carefully labeled with dates. Some going back decades. But the most disturbing part? Several frames had been removed, leaving empty spaces. As if something, or someone, had been taken out of history. At the end of the hallway was a locked door. Heavier than the rest. Reinforced. Recent scratches around the lock suggested it had been accessed more than once. Forensics forced it open. What they found inside made even seasoned investigators pause. It was not a storage room. Not an office. Not a living space. It was a monitored room. Small. Bare. With a single chair in the center. And cables running through the walls. Old surveillance equipment sat in one corner. Dusted, but still intact. Detective Bennett immediately ordered tech analysis. And what they recovered from the system was chilling. Dozens of archived video files. Some labeled. Some not. All recorded from inside Blackwood Manor. Different rooms. Different years. Different angles. But all tied to the same estate. And some footage showed something deeply unsettling. People entering rooms. And never being seen leaving again. Not in public footage. Not in household records. Not in any family mention. But the most important file was the most recent. Timestamped just 2 nights before the wedding. It showed Eleanor. Inside that same hidden wing. Walking slowly. Looking around. Confused. Like she had discovered something she wasn't supposed to see. In the video, she pauses near a wall. Places her hand on it. And whispers something unheard. Then suddenly turns back. As if she heard someone behind her. The footage cuts abruptly. But not before capturing a shadow behind her. Standing just out of frame. Watching. Detective Bennett replayed the clip 5 times. Then 6. Then 7. Each time, the same question formed. Who was inside that room with her? Meanwhile, outside the mansion, search teams made another discovery in the forest. A second item. This time buried beneath loose soil. A small pendant. Gold. Elegant. And engraved with initials. But not Eleanor's. Forensics confirmed the pendant belonged to someone else entirely. Someone linked to the Blackwood family records from years ago. A name that kept appearing in old documents but had never been fully explained. A name that had been quietly removed from public history. And when investigators traced it, they found something even more unsettling. That person was once officially listed as a resident of Blackwood Manor. But later was declared unaccounted for. No death record. No disappearance report. Just erased. Like they never existed. Back inside the manor, Detective Bennett confronted Eleanor's father again. This time with evidence. The hidden room. The surveillance footage. The pendant. The inconsistencies in family records. But instead of answers, she got resistance. Controlled answers. Carefully chosen words. And long pauses. When asked directly about the hidden wing, he finally responded. That part of the house is not relevant to Eleanor's disappearance. But Bennett didn't miss the phrasing. Not does not exist. Not I don't know. But not relevant. Which implied knowledge. And awareness. And possibly intentional omission. Then came the moment that shifted everything again. A technician analyzing the surveillance system noticed something odd in the metadata. One of the video files had been accessed recently. Not by investigators. Not by staff. But remotely. From inside the estate network. Within the last 48 hours. Meaning someone still had access. Someone still inside the system. Or someone still inside the house. As I'm applying a bit of eyeliner here, this is the moment where the story tightens again. Because now it wasn't just about what happened to Eleanor. It was about who was still controlling what investigators could see. And what they were being allowed to find. Detective Bennett stood in front of the hidden room one more time. Looking at the empty chair in the center. And said something quietly to her team. This isn't where she disappeared. This is where it started. And for the first time, everyone understood the direction this case was heading. Because Eleanor Blackwood didn't just vanish into a forest. She vanished out of a system. A structure. A place that had been hiding something far longer than anyone realized. And whatever that something was, it was still unfinished. By this point, the Blackwood case had expanded far beyond a missing bride. It had become a web of hidden rooms, erased records, and surveillance systems that seemed to protect something or someone. And every thread was slowly pulling investigators toward the same conclusion. This wasn't random. It was controlled. As I'm lightly brushing on a bit of foundation here, this is where detectives finally had to ask the uncomfortable question. If this was planned, who had the most control over Eleanor's world that night? The answer kept circling back to one person. Daniel Harper. Her husband. The man who stood beside her just hours before she disappeared. At first, Daniel had been treated as a secondary witness. A grieving spouse. A confused partner. But now, the evidence wasn't letting him stay in the background anymore. Detective Bennett officially brought him in for a formal, extended interrogation. And this time, it wasn't just about timeline inconsistencies. It was about contradictions. Because the more they reviewed his statements, the more they didn't align with physical evidence. Daniel insisted he stayed inside the ballroom for most of the night. But phone data showed movement toward the garden area multiple times. He claimed he never left Eleanor alone for long. But witness accounts placed him in different parts of the estate during critical minutes. And most importantly, he could not clearly explain what he was doing between 12:11 and 12:17 a.m. The exact window of Eleanor's disappearance. When confronted, Daniel became visibly tense. Not angry. Not emotional. Controlled. Careful. Like someone choosing every word before speaking it. Then came a question that changed the tone completely. Did Eleanor ever express fear of you or your family? A long pause. Too long. Then he said, no. She was happy. She wanted this marriage. But investigators already knew that wasn't entirely true. Because they had the bridesmaid statement. The one where Eleanor said, I don't feel safe tonight. And when that contradiction was presented to Daniel, something shifted in his demeanor. A flicker. A break in composure. But only for a moment. Then he returned to calm. Almost too quickly. Which made investigators even more certain they were closing in on something important. Meanwhile, forensic teams analyzed the broken hairpin found near the garden gate. The second material fragment attached to it was finally identified. It wasn't fabric. It was synthetic fiber. Used in high-end tactical outerwear. The kind worn by private security personnel. Or individuals trained to move quietly in low visibility conditions. That discovery changed the direction again. Because it suggested Eleanor didn't only meet someone in the garden. She may have been met by someone prepared. Equipped. Intentional. Not a random encounter. A planned interaction. Then came another breakthrough. The encrypted messages recovered from Eleanor's phone were fully decrypted. Most were fragmented conversations. But one thread stood out. A repeated exchange with an unknown number. And the final message from that contact, sent just before she left the reception, read, now. Or it all ends the way it started. No names. No explanation. Just pressure. And timing. Detective Bennett immediately flagged the message as critical. Because it suggested Eleanor wasn't just afraid. She was being directed. Controlled through communication. And possibly manipulated into movement. But the most disturbing part came next. A forensic review of Daniel's phone revealed something unexpected. A deleted contact. Not visible in his active list. Recovered through deep system analysis. A number. The same unidentified number Eleanor had been communicating with. The same one she had spoken to dozens of times. Which meant one thing investigators didn't want to say out loud yet. Eleanor and Daniel had both been connected to the same hidden contact. But in different ways. That changed everything. Because now the question was no longer, did Daniel know? It became, how much did he know? And more importantly, was he part of it, or being directed by it? As I'm putting on a bit of mascara here, this is where the case really splits into two possible realities. One where Daniel is a grieving husband caught in something bigger than him. And another where he is far more involved than he appears. Detective Bennett decided to test him directly. She presented the surveillance footage from the hidden wing. The moment Eleanor was seen inside the restricted area. And then asked him a simple question. Have you ever been inside this part of the house? For the first time, Daniel hesitated longer than before. Not just a pause. A silence. Then he said, no. I didn't even know that area existed. But Bennett didn't react immediately. She simply watched him, Because liars often explain too quickly. Or too smoothly. Daniel did neither. He stayed still. Controlled. Carefully composed. Which made the silence between them heavier than any answer. Then came the final piece of this phase. A security feed recovered from an auxiliary camera system. Not part of the main estate network. A backup system installed years earlier. And forgotten. It showed a figure entering the garden path at 12:14 a.m. Moving toward Eleanor. No face clearly visible. But the posture. The timing. The direction. All aligned with the last known movements before Eleanor vanished. And when enhanced frame analysis was applied. One detail stood out. A wedding band. On the figure's hand. Not Eleanor's. But consistent with a male hand. And consistent with someone already inside the wedding party. Detective Bennett stared at the screen for a long time. Then said quietly. Now we stop guessing. We start narrowing. Because at this point, the case no longer had dozens of possibilities. It had one central focus. Someone at that wedding had the opportunity, the access, and the timing. And whoever it was no longer just a witness. They were now the primary suspect. By now, the entire investigation had narrowed into something uncomfortable. Not because the evidence was complete, but because it was starting to point too clearly, too cleanly. And in cases like this, clarity is often the most dangerous thing of all. As I'm lightly applying a bit of lip gloss here, this is the moment where detectives thought they were finally closing in on the truth. But instead, the case did something it hadn't done before. It changed direction. Again. The breakthrough came from something small. Almost ignored. A detail buried in the background of the final garden camera footage. The same footage that showed the figure approaching Eleanor at 12:14 a.m. When analysts enhanced the image further, they noticed something odd. The figure wasn't acting like someone approaching a confrontation. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't even chaotic. It was deliberate. Too deliberate. Like someone following a pre-planned route. Which immediately raised a new question. What if Eleanor wasn't being followed? What if she was being guided? Detective Bennett called for a full re-examination of Eleanor's phone data one more time. And this time, they didn't focus on calls or messages. They focused on location patterns. What they found didn't match the earlier interpretation. Eleanor's movement through the estate that night wasn't random. It formed a sequence. A pattern. Almost like checkpoints. Ballroom. Corridor. Garden edge. Tree line. Each location aligned with a specific time-stamped communication event. Which meant something terrifying. Someone wasn't just talking to Eleanor. They were orchestrating her movement in real time. Step by step. Moment by moment. Like a controlled path leading her somewhere specific. But where? That question brought investigators back to the hidden wing. Because every clue still pointed inward. Not outward. Inside Blackwood Manor. Detective Bennett ordered a full sweep of the estate's internal access logs again. And this time, they discovered something that hadn't been noticed before. A manual override. Executed at 12:09 a.m. Just minutes before Eleanor left the reception. The override temporarily disabled certain internal alerts in the estate's security system, including motion detection in restricted corridors and partial camera synchronization in the East Wing. Which meant one thing. Someone inside the system had prepared the estate for movement that night. But what made it worse was who authorized the override. It wasn't staff. It wasn't security. And it wasn't automated. It was linked to a master access profile. A profile registered under the Blackwood estate's primary administrative credentials. Credentials that belonged to the family. And specifically, were tied to Eleanor's father. As I'm doing a little blending here, this is the kind of moment where everything in the room gets heavier. Because suddenly, the investigation wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It wasn't even just about Eleanor. It was about the structure of the entire estate system. Detective Bennett didn't accuse anyone immediately. Instead, she went back to the staff member who had worked at Blackwood Manor for decades. The same woman who had mentioned that restricted wing earlier. This time, Bennett asked a different question. Not about Eleanor. Not about Daniel. But about control. And access. And what she said next changed the tone of the entire case again. She admitted that certain systems inside the manor were never updated. Not due to negligence, but by design. Some areas of the estate were intentionally kept separate from modern security protocols. Old systems layered beneath newer ones. Systems only a few people understood fully. And one of those people was Eleanor's father. That statement created immediate tension in the investigation. Because it introduced something far more complex than a suspect. It introduced authority. Control over access. Control over records. Control over what could be seen. And what could be hidden. Meanwhile, forensic teams reviewed Eleanor's final audio recording again. And this time, they noticed something they had previously dismissed. Background noise. At first it sounded like wind. Or movement. But when enhanced, it became clearer. It wasn't wind. It was footsteps. Multiple sets. Moving through a hard surface corridor. Not outdoors. Inside. Which meant the recording might not have been made in the garden at all. It may have been made inside the manor itself. Shortly before she left. Or possibly while she was already being moved. That realization shifted everything again. Because it meant Eleanor's final moments may not have been in isolation, but inside a structure. Surrounded. Contained. Directed. And possibly observed. Detective Bennett sat back after hearing the enhanced audio. And said something quietly to her team. We've been treating this like a disappearance. But what if it was a transition? That word changed the atmosphere. Because disappearance implies absence. But transition implies movement from one controlled state to another. And that suggests planning. Intent. And execution. Then came the final twist of this section. A call came in from a remote property inspection team. They had been surveying old Blackwood estate land records outside the main manor grounds. And they found something unexpected. A secondary structure. Not listed in modern records. Partially buried in old documentation. And physically located beyond the forest boundary. A small private annex. Connected historically to the Blackwood estate. But long abandoned. Or at least, that was what records claimed. Because when investigators arrived at the site, they found fresh signs of disturbance. Recent tire tracks. Disturbed soil. And a locked entrance that showed signs of recent use. Detective Bennett looked at it for a long time. Then said, if she's not in the manor. Then someone moved her. And for the first time in the entire investigation, the possibility emerged that Eleanor Blackwood's disappearance wasn't contained to one location. It may have been part of something larger. Something structured. Something moving. Something still unfolding. And whoever was controlling it had not stopped yet. By the time investigators reached the abandoned annex beyond Blackwood Forest, the case had fully shifted shape. It was no longer about a missing bride. It was about movement. Patterns. And control. As I'm lightly setting my foundation here, this is the part where everything starts to converge, like all the scattered threads finally pulling toward one central point. The annex looked forgotten from a distance. But up close, it wasn't. Fresh tire tracks cut through the dirt road leading to it. The lock on the main door had been tampered with recently. and the ground near the entrance showed repeated foot traffic. Not old. Not abandoned. Recent. Detective Bennett stepped inside first. The air was heavy. Damp. The kind of stillness that feels unnatural in a place that should be empty. The structure was small compared to Blackwood Manor. But it had been built with purpose. Concrete walls. Reinforced doors. And a layout that didn't resemble a home or storage unit. It resembled something else entirely. A holding space. Rooms aligned in a way that suggested separation. Observation. Containment. And at the far end of the structure, they found a room with a single chair. Similar to the hidden room inside the manor. But this one was different. It showed signs of recent use. The chair wasn't covered in dust. There were faint scuff marks on the floor. And on the wall beside it. A faint imprint. As if something had been removed recently. Something mounted. Something electronic. Forensics immediately began scanning the area. And within minutes, they recovered fragments of data from a wiped storage device embedded in the structure's security system. What they recovered was incomplete. But enough. Enough to reconstruct the final timeline more clearly than ever before. And what it revealed was not a simple disappearance. It was a coordinated sequence. Eleanor had not simply walked into the garden alone. She had been guided through a series of controlled communications. Timed messages. Phone triggers. And environmental cues inside the estate system. Each step was deliberate. Each movement was influenced. Not physically forced at first, but psychologically directed. The data showed repeated access to Eleanor's phone from an unknown device connected to the estate network. Not hacking in the traditional sense, but interception. Meaning someone inside Blackwood Manor had the ability to monitor or influence communication patterns in real time. And then, the final piece of the sequence appeared. At 12:11 a.m., Eleanor received a message. At 12:12 a.m., she left the ballroom. At 12:14 a.m., she entered the garden path. At 12:16 a.m., she reached the tree line. And at 12:17 a.m., the system recorded a forced blackout in the east perimeter cameras. Not a technical failure. A manual trigger. And after that moment, no digital trace of Eleanor existed inside the main estate system. It was as if she had been removed from the record entirely. But the annex told a different story. Because inside one of the storage units, investigators found a single item. A small personal belonging. Carefully preserved. Not discarded. Not lost. Placed. A wedding accessory. Eleanor's bracelet. But what made it chilling wasn't just the object itself. It was what was attached to it. A small tag. With handwritten initials. Not hers. And not Daniel's. Which meant whoever had last handled this item was someone else entirely. Someone who had physical access to her belongings after the timeline went dark. Meanwhile, Detective Bennett re-examined Daniel Harper's movements one final time. And this time, something finally stood out clearly. At 12:13 a.m., Daniel's phone briefly connected to the same internal estate network used in the hidden wing systems. Just for a few seconds. Long enough to register access. Short enough to be overlooked initially. Which meant he had not only been present, but potentially within proximity of the system that controlled internal communication and surveillance. When confronted with this detail, Daniel's response changed. His composure cracked. Just slightly. And for the first time, he said, "I didn't know what they were doing that night. They said it was just part of the system check." That statement introduced something new. A third layer. Because it implied involvement from multiple people. Not a single actor. Not a single plan. But coordination. Then came the final confirmation from forensic analysis of Eleanor's audio recording. The footsteps in the background were matched against known movement patterns inside the estate flooring. And the results showed something definitive. At least 3 individuals were present in the structure where the recording was made. 3 sets of movement. 1 consistent with Eleanor. 2 others unidentified. And moving in synchronization. Which meant the final moments of Eleanor Blackwood were not isolated. They were structured, controlled, and contained within a system that extended beyond a single room. Or a single person. Detective Bennett closed the file quietly after reviewing everything. Then said, "This wasn't a disappearance. This was a managed transfer." And that changed everything again. Because now the investigation wasn't asking where Eleanor went. It was asking how long this system had existed. And how many others may have passed through it before her. By the time the investigation reached its breaking point, Blackwood Manor no longer felt like a place of wealth or legacy. It felt like something heavier. Something that had been holding secrets for too long. And those secrets were finally starting to breathe. As I'm softly blending a bit of blush here, this is the part where the case stops being about evidence. And starts becoming about people. Because behind every file, every footprint, every timestamp, there were real lives being shattered. Detective Bennett had been on difficult cases before. But this one stayed with her in a different way. Not because of the brutality. But because of the silence. The way everyone inside the story seemed to be holding something back. Like truth itself had been carefully rationed. When Eleanor's family was informed of the full scope of the investigation findings so far, the reaction wasn't what investigators expected. There was no public breakdown. No dramatic collapse. Instead, there was controlled distance. Careful statements. Lawyers immediately involved. And a refusal to answer direct questions without legal presence. That alone raised new concerns. Because grief, in its natural form, is rarely that structured. Meanwhile, Daniel Harper was placed under extended observation. Not formally charged. Not released. Just contained within legal boundaries of the investigation. And during that time, he gave a final statement. Not to the press. But privately to Detective Bennett. And what he said didn't clear him. But it didn't fully implicate him either. He said, "I loved her. But I don't think I ever really understood what she was afraid of." That sentence sat heavily in the room. Because it confirmed something investigators had suspected for a while. Eleanor's fear didn't begin the night of the wedding. It had existed long before it. But was never fully seen. Or fully acknowledged. Outside the manor, the town of Ashford reacted in waves. At first, it was shock. Then speculation. Then silence. People stopped discussing the wedding openly. Not because they lost interest. But because the story stopped feeling like entertainment. And started feeling like something too close to reality. Too personal. At Blackwood Manor itself, staff began resigning. One by one. Some refused to return to the estate at all. Others left without explanation. One housekeeper reportedly said, "I worked there for 18 years. And I still don't know what that house really was." And that sentence echoed what many were beginning to feel. That Blackwood Manor was not just a residence. It was a system. One that had operated quietly for years. Invisible to most. Unquestioned by many. And only now. Being examined under the harsh light of investigation. As I'm putting on a little setting spray here, this is where the emotional weight of the case really settles in. Because investigators weren't just dealing with one disappearance anymore. They were dealing with the possibility that Eleanor's case was part of a longer pattern of silence. And the more they looked, the more gaps they found. Old estate records with missing entries. Employment histories that ended abruptly. Individuals who had once been connected to the property. And were later untraceable. Not officially missing. Not officially deceased. Just absent from documentation. Like they had been removed from the system entirely. Detective Bennett began documenting everything in a separate report. Not for prosecution, but for preservation. Because she feared something larger. That if this case closed too quickly, the structure behind it might never be fully exposed. Then came one final development that shifted the emotional tone again. A small package arrived at the precinct. No return address. No sender information. Inside was a single item. A wedding photograph. Eleanor standing in the garden. Smiling. Beautiful. Alive. But on the back of the photo was a handwritten note. Short. Simple. And deeply unsettling. It read, "She wasn't the first." Detective Bennett didn't share that message immediately. Not publicly. Not with the media. Because once those words were introduced, the case stopped belonging only to Eleanor Blackwood and started belonging to something much larger. Something still unresolved. And still, possibly, unfinished. By the end of the investigation, Blackwood Manor was no longer just a place connected to Eleanor Blackwood's disappearance. It had become a question. One that didn't have a clean answer. And maybe never would. As I'm gently removing my makeup here, this is the part where everything slows down, but never really resolves. Because even though detectives built a timeline, reconstructed movements, and identified patterns of control, one core truth remained frustratingly incomplete. Eleanor Blackwood was never truly seen leaving Blackwood Manor alive. Not in a way that could be fully verified. Not in a way that felt settled. What investigators were left with instead was a sequence of controlled events, fragmented surveillance, and overlapping human accounts that suggested something carefully orchestrated behind the scenes. But orchestration doesn't always equal clarity. It often creates more questions than answers. Daniel Harper was never formally charged in connection with Eleanor's disappearance. There wasn't enough direct physical evidence to meet the threshold. But he also wasn't fully cleared. His timeline inconsistencies, network access logs, and proximity to key system overrides remained unresolved points in the case file. Legally, he existed in a gray area. And that gray area became part of the case's lingering tension. Eleanor's father was questioned extensively regarding estate systems, access control, and the restricted wing of Blackwood Manor. While no direct criminal charges were filed against him either, investigators noted significant gaps in historical documentation that could not be easily explained. And those gaps remained open, unfilled, unanswered. The hidden wing of Blackwood Manor was eventually sealed off under official supervision. But what it contained raised a broader concern within the investigation team. Because it suggested something important. That the structure of the estate itself had been built with layers of secrecy that extended beyond Eleanor's lifetime. And possibly beyond this single case. The abandoned annex outside the forest was also documented and secured. But its connection to the main estate system was never fully understood. It stood as a physical extension of something that clearly operated across multiple spaces, multiple timelines, and possibly multiple individuals over the years. Eleanor Blackwood herself was never recovered. Not physically. Not conclusively. And that absence became the most defining part of the case. Because without closure, every theory remains just that. A theory. What makes this case linger isn't just what was discovered. It's what wasn't. The missing pages from her journal. The unidentified woman in the photograph. The encrypted communications. The unexplained system access. The erased records. And the final message left behind. She wasn't the first. That single line reframed everything investigators thought they understood. Because it suggested Eleanor's disappearance might not have been an isolated event, but part of something older. Something structured. Something repeating. And that idea changes the emotional weight of everything that came before it. As I finish this look here, I just keep thinking about how some stories don't really end when the investigation does. They just pause, waiting for the next piece of information to bring them into focus again. Blackwood Manor still stands today. Quiet. Unchanged on the outside. But for those who work the case, it is northwest longer just an estate on a hill. It is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are not the ones hidden in darkness, but the ones built into the structure of everyday life. And those are the ones that take the longest to uncover, because they don't disappear with time. They wait. If you like this channel or story, don't forget to subscribe. Please subscribe to Blush and Blood.